In the heart of Victorian England, in the year 1872, rain fell steadily over the streets of Bristol, softening the outlines of stone buildings and darkening the cobblestones beneath passing carriages. The sky was gray, low, and heavy, as if the city itself had lowered its gaze. Beneath the narrow shelter of a brick archway, a young woman stood still, her cloak drawn close against the cold. She listened to the sound of rain striking stone and metal, steady and unhurried, while gas lamps flickered along the street. To anyone passing by, she appeared unremarkable, simply another woman waiting out the weather. Yet beneath her calm exterior lay a truth that had already cost her everything. Only a short time before, her life had followed a predictable and respectable path. She had known comfort, security, and the quiet expectations placed upon women of her class. Then came love, unexpected, sincere, and believed to be lasting. Promises had been spoken with confidence, spoken as if no force could undo them. When she discovered she was with child, she trusted those promises would hold. Instead, silence answered her. Letters ceased. Doors closed. The man she loved chose absence over responsibility, leaving her to face a world that offered little mercy to women who stood alone. Her family's response was swift and absolute. In their well-appointed home, surrounded by polished wood, high ceilings, and generations of portraits, judgment replaced affection. Reputation mattered more than explanation. She was told she had brought disgrace upon them, and by nightfall she was no longer welcome beneath their roof. There were no raised voices, no dramatic farewells, only firm words and final decisions. She left with a small bag and a heavier burden than she could have imagined, stepping into the rain without knowing where she would sleep. Days later, the weather cleared, and the harbor revealed itself beneath a pale morning sun. Ships lined the docks, their tall masts rising against the open sky. The air smelled of salt, rope, and coal smoke, and the cries of gulls carried over the water. Among the vessels preparing to depart, one stood ready for a long crossing. It offered no comfort, only passage. With her remaining coins pressed tightly in her hand and one thought guiding her forward, she approached the gangway. Distance, she believed, might offer what home no longer could. As she stepped closer to the ship, she understood that this journey marked a clear division in her life, before and after. She would leave behind her name, her history, and the certainty she once possessed. Ahead lay uncertainty, strangers, and a future she could not yet imagine. Still, beneath the fear, there was resolve. She placed a steady hand over her abdomen and took her first step aboard, unaware that this voyage would shape not only her survival, but the course of her heart in ways she could never have foreseen. In the heart of Victorian England, in the year 1872, rain fell steadily over the streets of Bristol, softening the outlines of stone buildings and darkening the cobblestones beneath passing carriages. The sky was gray, low, and heavy, as if the city itself had lowered its gaze. Beneath the narrow shelter of a brick archway, a young woman stood still, her cloak drawn close against the cold. She listened to the sound of rain striking stone and metal, steady and unhurried, while gas lamps flickered along the street. To anyone passing by, she appeared unremarkable, simply another woman waiting out the weather. Yet beneath her calm exterior lay a truth that had already cost her everything. Only a short time before, her life had followed a predictable and respectable path. She had known comfort, security, and the quiet expectations placed upon women of her class. Then came love, unexpected, sincere, and believed to be lasting. Promises had been spoken with confidence, spoken as if no force could undo them. When she discovered she was with child, she trusted those promises would hold. Instead, silence answered her. Letters ceased. Doors closed. The man she loved chose absence over responsibility, leaving her to face a world that offered little mercy to women who stood alone. Her family's response was swift and absolute. In their well-appointed home, surrounded by polished wood, high ceilings, and generations of portraits, judgment replaced affection. Reputation mattered more than explanation. She was told she had brought disgrace upon them, and by nightfall she was no longer welcome beneath their roof. There were no raised voices, no dramatic farewells, only firm words and final decisions. She left with a small bag and a heavier burden than she could have imagined, stepping into the rain without knowing where she would sleep. Days later, the weather cleared, and the harbor revealed itself beneath a pale morning sun. Ships lined the docks, their tall masts rising against the open sky. The air smelled of salt, rope, and coal smoke, and the cries of gulls carried over the water. Among the vessels preparing to depart, one stood ready for a long crossing. It offered no comfort, only passage. With her remaining coins pressed tightly in her hand and one thought guiding her forward, she approached the gangway. Distance, she believed, might offer what home no longer could. As she stepped closer to the ship, she understood that this journey marked a clear division in her life, before and after. She would leave behind her name, her history, and the certainty she once possessed. Ahead lay uncertainty, strangers, and a future she could not yet imagine. Still, beneath the fear, there was resolve. She placed a steady hand over her abdomen and took her first step aboard, unaware that this voyage would shape not only her survival, but the course of her heart in ways she could never have foreseen. The ship advanced steadily across the gray-blue waters of the Atlantic, its movement slow but deliberate, as if time itself had chosen to move at a gentler pace. From the deck, the woman watched the horizon stretch endlessly before her, a thin line separating sea from sky, both uncertain and vast. She had given her name as Eleanor Whitmore when she purchased her passage, a name spoken softly, without hesitation, though it was not the one she had been born with. That name now belonged to a life she no longer claimed. Wrapped in a modest coat, she moved carefully, aware of every step, every shift of her body, conscious of the life growing within her and the need to remain unnoticed. Around her, other passengers settled into routines born of necessity rather than comfort, their faces marked by fatigue, resolve, or quiet expectation. Some were families seeking opportunity, others solitary figures escaping debts, scandals, or memories better left behind. No one asked questions, and she was grateful for that silence. Each morning began with a low murmur of voices, the creak of timber, and the measured footsteps of sailors attending to their duties, while the smell of salt and damp wood filled the air. She found solace in these simple repetitions, for they required nothing of her beyond endurance. At times, she stood near the rail, allowing the cool wind to steady her thoughts, her gaze fixed on the rolling waves that seemed to erase yesterday with every rise and fall. Her past, however, was not so easily washed away. In quieter moments, her thoughts returned to the house she had left behind, with its tall windows, polished floors, and rigid expectations, a place where affection had always been measured and conditional. She remembered the evening her condition had been discovered, the controlled voices, the absence of outrage only because shame did not require it, and the final instruction delivered with calm certainty that she was no longer welcome. That memory carried no anger now, only a dull ache and the understanding that there would be no letters, no inquiries, no concern for whether she survived or failed. The man who had promised her a future remained an even deeper wound, not because of cruelty, but because of his disappearance. The way his absence spoke louder than rejection ever could. She had waited days for a reply that never came, convincing herself that circumstances, not cowardice, had silenced him, until time made that belief impossible to sustain. A few nights into the journey, the weather shifted and the sea grew restless, the ship responding with long, heavy movements that unsettled even the most seasoned passengers. She retreated to the lower deck, where lantern light cast uneven shadows along the walls and the air was thick with the scent of oil and iron. There, surrounded by the muted sounds of discomfort and prayer, she rested a hand against her abdomen, seeking reassurance in the steady rhythm of her own breathing. Fear visited her often in those hours, not dramatic or overwhelming, but persistent, whispering questions she could not answer. What awaited her on the far shore? Whether survival would demand more than she could give, whether her child would one day ask about a father whose name she had already begun to forget. In the days that followed, she became aware of a quiet presence among the passengers, a man who spoke little and observed much, whose clothing suggested education without extravagance, and whose manner reflected restraint rather than pride. Their paths crossed occasionally, in passing glances and brief exchanges of courtesy. Nothing more, yet his presence registered with her in a way she could not immediately explain. Perhaps it was because he, too, seemed unanchored, belonging neither to the crew nor fully to the other travelers, or perhaps it was simply that solitude recognizes itself in others. She did not seek his attention, nor did he impose it, and for that reason alone she felt at ease when he was nearby. As the voyage continued, days blended into one another, marked by changing skies and the steady advance toward an unknown destination. There were moments of quiet beauty, when sunlight broke through the clouds and scattered across the water, and moments of unease when fog reduced the world to a narrow circle of uncertainty. Through it all, she remained composed, careful, and inwardly determined, guided by the simple conviction that she must endure. Whatever awaited her at the journey's end would be faced not as the woman she had been, but as the woman necessity had shaped her into, carrying with her a secret, a child, and the fragile hope that somewhere beyond the horizon, judgment might finally loosen its hold. The days that followed settled into a measured rhythm, shaped by the ship's steady progress and the unspoken understanding among those aboard that each person carried a story better left untold. Eleanor se adaptu rapidamente, apprendendo quando permanser visible y quando desaparecer segundo plano, escogiendo cuidadosamente sus momentos no conves para evitar atenção desnecessária. Omar estava mais calmo agora, sua superfície se estendendo wide and reflective beneath changing skies, and the air carried a cooler sharpness that hinted at distant lands. She spent long hours observing small details, the careful knots tied by sailors, the way shadows shifted across the planks, the quiet discipline that governed life at sea, finding comfort in order where her own life had lost it. Yet beneath this calm exterior, her thoughts were never still. Each morning brought a renewed awareness of her condition, subtle but undeniable, and with it the knowledge that time, once her ally, now moved against her. Concealment would not remain possible forever. It was during one such morning, as she stood near the rail watching sunlight break through thinning clouds, that the man she had noticed before spoke to her for the first time. His greeting was polite, restrained, offered without expectation, and she answered in kind, careful to keep her tone neutral. His name, he said, was Thomas Hawley. He spoke as one accustomed to choosing words deliberately, neither seeking familiarity nor avoiding it. Their exchange was brief, unremarkable in content, yet afterward she found herself more aware of his presence, not because he pursued conversation, but because he did not. Over the following days they encountered one another occasionally, sometimes exchanging a few words about the weather or the ship's progress, sometimes merely sharing silence while gazing toward the horizon. He never asked where she came from or where she was bound, and she did not offer the information. This mutual restraint formed a quiet understanding between them, one that felt rare and unexpectedly valuable. As the voyage continued, the ship passed through stretches of heavy fog that reduced the world to a narrow corridor of sound and movement, the sea hidden, the sky indistinguishable from the water. During these hours, anxiety spread among the passengers. whispers circulating through the lower decks, fears magnified by uncertainty. Eleanor remained composed, though unease pressed steadily upon her, heightened by the knowledge that illness or suspicion could place her in a precarious position. It was during one such evening, when the ship rolled gently and lanterns swayed overhead, that a disturbance arose among the crew, sparked by a woman taken suddenly ill. The confined space filled with murmurs and concern, and Eleanor felt a sharp awareness of her own vulnerability. Thomas was nearby then, assisting without drawing attention, his manner calm and efficient, and she observed how others deferred to him, not out of rank, but trust. That night, as the ship pressed onward through the fog, she found herself reflecting on how necessity often revealed character more clearly than comfort ever could. The following morning brought clearer skies and a return of sunlight, lifting spirits across the ship. Eleanor ventured onto the deck earlier than usual, drawn by the warmth and the need for air, and there she encountered Thomas once more. Their conversation extended slightly longer this time, touching upon books, travel, and the peculiar sense of suspension that came with life at sea. She learned he was traveling to the colonies to assume a position arranged through family connections, a role defined more by obligation than desire. He did not elaborate, nor did she press him, but she recognized in his words the familiar weight of expectation and duty. As days turned into weeks, Eleanor grew increasingly aware of the careful balance she maintained, the effort required to appear unaffected, ordinary, unburdened. Yet the strain could not be hidden entirely. There came a moment, quiet and unobserved by others, when dizziness forced her to sit, her composure briefly slipping. Thomas noticed, offering assistance without alarm or inquiry, and though she declined further help, the exchange marked a subtle shift between them. She sensed that he understood more than he said, not through knowledge, but perception. The realization unsettled her, yet it also brought a sense of relief she had not anticipated. She had spent so long guarding herself that the presence of someone who did not seek to expose her felt almost disarming. Still, trust remained a risk she could not afford lightly. At night, lying awake to the sound of water striking the hull, Eleanor weighed her circumstances with increasing urgency. The future she envisioned upon leaving England had been vague, shaped by hope rather than plan, but reality now demanded precision. Employment for a woman alone would be limited, her condition further narrowing those possibilities. Respectability, once taken for granted, had become a fragile commodity she could lose entirely. It was during these hours that the idea first formed, tentative and unwelcome, yet persistent. Survival might require compromise, and identity, once lost, might need to be reshaped again. As the ship advanced toward its destination, carrying its passengers closer to lives not yet defined, Eleanor felt the quiet certainty that the crossing itself was preparing her for a choice she could no longer delay, one that would bind her fate to another not through affection, but necessity, and that the calm she now experienced was merely the stillness before a decisive turning of her life. The certainty that a decision awaited her followed Eleanor through the remaining days of the voyage, pressing gently but persistently against her thoughts as the ship moved ever closer to its destination. She felt it in the way she measured her steps, in the careful way she folded her hands when seated, in the deliberate calm she maintained even as fatigue began to show in subtle ways she could no longer fully conceal. The sea grew calmer, its surface stretching wide and pale beneath clear skies, and the passengers spoke more frequently of arrival, of prospects, of futures imagined and revised with each passing mile. Eleanor listened more than she spoke, aware that soon observation would no longer suffice. Her condition, once an abstract concern, had begun to assert itself with quiet insistence, and she understood that upon reaching land, anonymity would become far more difficult to maintain. It was during one such afternoon, as she stood alone on deck watching the sun settle lower in the sky, that Thomas approached her with an expression more serious than she had seen before. His manner remained composed, yet there was a deliberate intent in his words as he asked, gently and without accusation, whether she was well. The question was simple, but its weight unsettled her, and for the first time since boarding the ship, she hesitated before answering. She offered a careful assurance, one that satisfied neither of them, and in the silence that followed, she sensed an understanding forming that could no longer be ignored. He did not press her further then, but the exchange lingered between them, unspoken yet unmistakable. That evening, unable to sleep, Eleanor walked the deck under a sky scattered with faint stars, the air cool and steady, and it was there that Thomas joined her once more, his presence quiet and unintrusive. He spoke of his own circumstances with a candor he had previously withheld, explaining that his journey was not born of ambition but arrangement, that a position awaited him in the colonies along with expectations he neither sought nor entirely rejected. He spoke of duty, of the quiet sacrifices required to preserve stability, and Eleanor recognized the familiar language of obligation, the same language that had once governed her own life. When she finally spoke, her words emerged slowly, chosen with care, revealing fragments rather than the full truth. She acknowledged her altered circumstances, her lack of protection, the precariousness of her future as a woman alone. She did not name the child she carried, nor the man who had abandoned her, but she did not deny them either. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, and when she finished, he neither questioned nor withdrew. Instead, he spoke plainly, stating that her situation, as he understood it, would place her at considerable disadvantage upon arrival, and that the world they were entering was not inclined toward mercy. His words were not cruel, merely honest, and she found herself grateful for the absence of false reassurance. The conversation ended without resolution, yet something essential had shifted. In the days that followed, Eleanor sensed a quiet vigilance in Thomas's presence, a watchfulness that did not intrude but reassured. He did not alter his behavior outwardly, yet she knew she was no longer unseen. As the coastline of the new land finally appeared on the horizon, faint at first and then unmistakable, anticipation rippled through the ship, accompanied by an undercurrent of apprehension. Eleanor felt both keenly. The moment she had fled toward was now unavoidable, and with it came the reckoning she had delayed. It was on the morning before their arrival, as the ship slowed and preparations were made, that Thomas sought her once more, choosing a quiet corner away from others. His words were measured, his tone respectful, and what he proposed was neither romantic nor impulsive. He spoke of marriage as arrangement, of mutual benefit rather than affection, of the protection such a union would afford her and the legitimacy it would grant the child she carried, whose existence he acknowledged at last without judgment or reproach. In return, he asked for discretion, for loyalty, for a partnership defined by respect and necessity. Eleanor listened, her heart steady yet heavy, fully aware of what acceptance would require. This was not the future she had imagined when she first stepped aboard the ship, nor was it the love she had once believed in, but it was a future nonetheless, structured, survivable, and free from immediate disgrace. She weighed the offer not with sentiment, but clarity, understanding that refusal would leave her exposed in a world that had already proven unforgiving. When she answered, her voice was calm, though the decision itself carried profound consequence. She agreed, not out of hope, but resolve, recognizing that dignity, once stripped away, could sometimes only be reclaimed through compromise. As the ship prepared to dock, Eleanor stood at the rail once more, her hand resting protectively against her abdomen, aware that the life ahead would demand restraint, silence, and endurance, yet also understanding that within those limits lay the possibility of stability. The crossing that had begun as escape had become transformation, and as land drew near, Eleanor accepted that the woman she had been no longer existed, replaced by one shaped by necessity, bound by agreement, and carrying forward not only a secret past, but a carefully constructed future. The transition from sea to land unfolded with a sense of restrained urgency, as if every movement carried consequence beyond its immediate purpose. And Eleanor felt this acutely as the ship finally docked and the passengers disembarked beneath a pale, unfamiliar sky. The port city greeted them with orderly streets, newly erected buildings of stone and timber, and an air heavy with industry rather than refinement, a place defined not by history but by intention. Thomas moved with quiet authority, guiding the necessary arrangements with efficiency, and Eleanor followed his lead, aware that from this moment forward their lives were no longer separate. They presented themselves as a married couple in all formal matters, the fiction accepted without scrutiny, for the world preferred simplicity to truth. A modest residence had been secured in advance, respectable in appearance and discreet in location, its rooms sparse but orderly, offering neither luxury nor discomfort. Within its walls, Eleanor felt the unfamiliar weight of legitimacy settle upon her, a status regained not through forgiveness, but through careful construction. The days that followed were marked by adjustment, by learning the unspoken rules of a society that valued restraint, propriety, and outward harmony above all else. Eleanor adopted her role with deliberate precision, managing the household, observing customs, and maintaining a demeanor that discouraged inquiry. Her condition advanced quietly, now acknowledged openly within the privacy of their home, and Thomas ensured that no circumstance arose that might invite speculation. Their interactions remained formal, governed by mutual respect and clearly defined boundaries, yet beneath this restraint lay an unspoken understanding of shared risk. Each depended upon the other's discretion, and in that dependence a subtle bond formed, one rooted not in affection, but reliability. As weeks passed, Eleanor became increasingly aware of the contrast between her former life and this one. Where once she had been constrained by expectation and lineage, she now operated within limitations shaped by necessity, and though these limits were no less restrictive, they carried a sense of purpose she had not known before. Thomas's role within the community expanded gradually, his position granting him a measure of stability and recognition, and Eleanor fulfilled her part with quiet competence, attending gatherings when required, offering polite conversation, and cultivating an image of reserved domesticity. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when their exchanges softened, when a shared glance or brief remark hinted at something approaching companionship, yet neither allowed these moments to linger. Both understood the danger of confusion, the importance of preserving the terms upon which their arrangement rested. Despite this discipline, Eleanor could not entirely suppress the awareness of her past, nor the fear that it might one day intrude upon the carefully ordered present. News from England arrived sporadically, carried by travelers or distant correspondents, and though she never sought it, she listened when it reached her, alert to any mention that might threaten her constructed identity. Thomas, too, remained vigilant, ensuring that no unnecessary connections were maintained, no inquiries encouraged. As Eleanor's pregnancy became visible, explanations were offered and accepted without challenge, the timing attributed to the natural course of marriage, and she observed with quiet irony how easily the world accepted what was presented confidently. Yet beneath this surface compliance, anxiety persisted, sharpened by the knowledge that stability, once achieved, could be lost as swiftly as it had been before. In private moments, Eleanor reflected upon the child she carried, the life that would soon enter a world shaped by compromise and secrecy, and she questioned whether such a foundation could sustain more than survival. Thomas, for his part, fulfilled his obligations with consistency, neither overstepping nor withdrawing, and Eleanor recognized the integrity in his restraint. He did not claim authority over her beyond what was necessary, nor did he offer gestures that might blur the nature of their agreement. This balance, carefully maintained, became the cornerstone of their coexistence. Yet as the months progressed and Eleanor's vulnerability became more pronounced, the distance between necessity and sentiment grew increasingly difficult to define. There were evenings when the quiet of the house pressed upon them both, when conversation extended beyond practicality into reflection, and Eleanor sensed the emergence of trust, not demanded but earned through conduct. Still, she guarded herself, aware that reliance could easily become attachment, and attachment carried risks she could not afford. As the time of her confinement approached, preparations were made with discretion, and Eleanor faced the impending transformation with a mixture of resolve and apprehension. The life she had fled seemed distant now, almost unreal, yet its shadow lingered, reminding her that security was not synonymous with peace. In the ordered calm of their adopted life, Eleanor understood that her greatest challenge lay not in preserving the illusion they had built, but in reconciling the woman she had become with the one she once was, and in determining whether endurance alone could eventually give way to something more enduring than survival. The final weeks before the child's birth passed with deliberate calm, as if Eleanor and Thomas had both agreed, without ever speaking it aloud, that disorder must be held at bay through discipline and restraint. The household moved according to a quiet routine, each task performed with care, each decision weighed for its potential consequence, and Eleanor found that this order, though born of necessity, provided her with a sense of steadiness she had once believed impossible. When the first pains came, they arrived not dramatically, but insistently. In the early hours before dawn, accompanied by a deep stillness that seemed to settle over the house. Thomas acted without hesitation, summoning the midwife already discreetly arranged, ensuring that no unnecessary attention was drawn, his composure unwavering even as the gravity of the moment became undeniable. Eleanor endured the long hours that followed with quiet resolve, her thoughts drifting not toward fear, but clarity, as if the life she had lived until now had been leading her precisely to this moment. When the child was finally placed in her arms, small and warm and undeniably real, something within her shifted irrevocably. This was no longer a secret carried in silence, nor a burden shaped by shame, but a life that existed openly, demanding protection rather than concealment. The infant's arrival was recorded as expected, accepted without question by the community that required only consistency, not truth, and Eleanor observed with subdued astonishment how the simple alignment of appearances transformed scandal into normalcy. In the days that followed, exhaustion settled over her like a heavy veil, yet beneath it lay a growing sense of purpose that steadied her in ways nothing else had. Thomas fulfilled his role with the same measured reliability that had defined their arrangement from the beginning, neither distant nor possessive, attentive without intrusion, and Eleanor recognized that this constancy, though devoid of overt sentiment, had become something she relied upon more than she had anticipated. It was during this fragile period that the past, long restrained at the edge of her awareness, threatened to intrude with force. News arrived quietly, carried through indirect channels, of inquiries made in England regarding a young woman who had vanished under circumstances best left unexplored. A name was mentioned, one Eleanor had not spoken in many months, and with it came the unmistakable realization that her former life, though distant, had not entirely released its hold. The risk was no longer theoretical. Exposure would not only undo her own stability, but imperil the child whose existence now defined her resolve. Faced with this threat, Eleanor made a decision that marked the final severing of her former identity. She gathered the remaining documents she had carried across the ocean, remnants of a life once assumed permanent, and destroyed them deliberately, not in haste or panic, but with composure. The act was not born of denial but acceptance. She understood then that survival had required deception, but continuation required ownership of the self she had become. When she spoke to Thomas of the danger, revealing more of her history than she ever had before, she did so without expectation of reassurance. His response was characteristically restrained, yet decisive. He affirmed that whatever had existed before held no authority over their present, and that the life they had constructed, fragile though it might be, was worth defending through discretion and resolve rather than fear. There was no declaration of devotion, no transformation of their agreement into romance. Yet, in his unwavering support, Eleanor recognized a form of loyalty more durable than promises once whispered in secrecy. As time passed, the threat receded, inquiries dissolved into silence, and the world resumed its indifference, content with the narrative presented to it. Eleanor settled into motherhood with a seriousness shaped by experience rather than sentimentality, her affection expressed through vigilance and quiet presence rather than overt tenderness. In watching her child sleep, she reflected upon the path that had brought her here, the love that had failed her, the family that had rejected her, and the choices that had reshaped her life not according to desire, but necessity. There was no longing to reclaim what had been lost, only a sober understanding that identity was not fixed by birth or approval, but forged through endurance and decision. In Thomas, she did not find romance as she had once imagined it, yet she found respect, stability, and a shared commitment to preservation, and she accepted that this, too, was a form of partnership. As the months unfolded, Eleanor moved through the world with a quiet confidence earned through survival, her past no longer a wound but a foundation upon which she stood firmly. She had crossed an ocean believing escape would save her, only to discover that salvation lay not in distance, but in the courage to remain, to adapt, and to claim responsibility for the life she carried forward. The woman who had boarded the ship without destination no longer existed, replaced by one who understood that belonging was not granted by acceptance, but built through resilience, discretion, and the unwavering determination to endure.